Don't make me pull this car over. I'm sure you probably have heard that. You may have said that to your kids. When my daddy said that, we didn't want him to pull the car over. Because if it got stopped, it didn't matter who had done what. We all were going to get it. Trips can be stressful, can't they? We can get on each other's nerves. We need some rules upon trips, like that we will be kind and loving to each other, that we will stay on our side of the seat. I'm not touching you. You know those kind of trips. I remember growing up that my dad had this idea in his mind that he wanted to get somewhere at a certain time, so we didn't stop for bathroom breaks until he got old enough that he needed to stop every 2 hours, and then the rule was you had to stop for bathroom breaks. It's kind of crazy, isn't it, how we have these different rules in our lives. Over the past few months, I've wanted someone to say, hey, let's pull this world over. Let's stop this for just a minute. Let's think through what we are doing. We are all in this world together. Could we be kind to one another? Could we help one another along the way? Could we stop aggravating our brothers and sisters? Could we obey the laws of God? We are living in stressful days. I'm not going to even go through the litany of stresses that we are under. You know what they are, and I'm tired of talking about them. But we are in stressful days. The children of Israel were wandering through the desert. As we have looked at some advice of life during desert times, we began by talking about accepting the situation, knowing where we are and realizing that God is still with us. Then last week we talked about getting some help, sometimes having to stop and ask for directions, to come together and realize that we are all in this together. And today we're talking about obeying the rules. When God had the children of Israel out in the desert, he literally did pull them over for a few minutes. Around Mount Sinai, they gathered. And as they were there, Moses went up to receive the law. In other words, God said, if you're going to be my people, you're going to have to act in certain ways. We call those today come to Jesus meetings. Back then, I guess they called them come to Yahweh meetings. For God, the Lord, stopped the progress of the people upon the journey and said, if we're going to be on this journey, we're going to need some rules. You see, you don't make it through desert times without having a few guidelines. You don't make it through crises without knowing some ways to act, some ways to keep moving along. I think about way back when they had the Oregon Trail, and those pioneers used to gather in those covered wagons, and they would go from that Missouri River over to the Oregon valleys. Many of them were immigrants to our land, and it was a long, treacherous journey through mountains and through deserts and through rivers. It was a dangerous journey, and they needed some rules. Those wagon trains got together, and they formed some rules. God gave his people the 10 Commandments because he wanted to form a people for himself. God wanted, when they got to the Holy Land, for them not to be the same as when they left Egypt. He not only got the slaves out of Egypt, he had to get Egypt out of the slaves. God wanted to create a people that God hoped would represent himself, would show the world the way to be and to act. God has that same desire for us today, God's church. God is always forming and reforming the church, hoping that we will be God's people. And when we go through desert times, God can use these to form us. But we can also get lost along the way. Desert times can be dangerous. That is why God gave the children of Israel the 10 Commandments to help guide these people along this journey. If they're going to be in community with one another, they're going to need to learn how to act and to behave. He gave these 10 Commandments first to establish that God's self, has to be first. Those first 4 commandments: we will have no other gods before God, that we will not make any graven images, that we will not take the Lord's name in vain, that we will remember the Sabbath and keep it holy, all have to do with our relationship with God. I was talking about the Oregon Trail earlier, and when they got together, they often hired something called a trail captain, or they sometimes called them a wagon master. They found someone who knew the way, who knew the perils, who knew how to get there, and then they had to decide whether or not to listen to that person. Now, why would you hire this expert, this guide, and then get off on the trail and decide to do whatever you wanted to? Well, we're people, right? We do that kind of thing. We all come this morning, we say we're going to put God first and foremost in our life. We're going to follow the ways of God. We're going to be the people of God. And yet, we wander off here and there. When we go through dangerous times, desert times, wandering off is not the best idea. We can get lost. We can get hurt along the way. So we must first and foremost put God as number one in our life. How do you do that? Well, you get some points this morning. You're at worship, or you're worshiping with us online. You're showing that you are putting God first in your life. But what about throughout the week? When you get up first thing in the morning, what do you think about? Perhaps your day and all the things that have going on. Perhaps, where's the coffee pot? Let me just get going here. But could we start our mornings with prayer? Could we each morning give the day to God and say, God, whatever is before me today, I want you to guide me through it. How about throughout the day? As you go through your day, do you stop and recheck in with God and say, am I on the right path? Am I doing the right things? Maybe when that phone rings, before you answer it, do you say, Lord, whatever happens in this conversation, let you be first. At the end of your day, do you look back over the day? Do you review it and say, God, have I always kept you first today? God says, I am the God who brought you to this place, and you will have no other gods before me. You won't make any graven images. You might say, well, Pastor, we don't have any idols. Oh, surely we do, though. What comes before God in your life? I've often said that if you would let me look at your calendar and your checkbook, I can tell you in about 30 seconds the priorities of your life, what you put first in your life. For where we spend our time and where we invest our treasure, that truly is what is important to us. Today, I think I could do it just as quickly by looking at your phone, looking at your searches, looking at who you talk to, those kind of things that show where we're spending our time. Is God first and foremost, or are there idols in our life? God says, don't take my name in vain. God is not just talking about don't cuss or swear, although we should not do those things. But rather, if we claim the name of God, if we say that we are Christians, does that mean anything to us? What does it mean to take the Lord's name in vain? Well, vain means empty, means hollow or shallow. How do we express our relationship with God? Do we even act like God is present in our lives, or do we just give God a cursory thought and then that's the end of it? Jesus in Matthew 15 quotes the prophet Isaiah, and he says, the people honor me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain they worship me. We can even be sitting here in worship this morning and take the Lord's name in vain by not recognizing the holiness and the sacredness of life. As we have been on this journey, as a people of God, as we are in difficult days, do we truly ask God to be present with us? Or do we just chunk it all and say, I'm going to do whatever it is I want to do? That would be taking the Lord's name in vain. Remember the Sabbath and keep it holy. There should be some time in our life when we truly stop everything else and we give that time to God and we worship God. Whether we come together or whether we are online and worshiping in our homes, we take this seriously. So many times I've heard people talk about worship as if it's a filling station. We like to come and we like to get pumped up. We like to get a little bit of the Spirit and then go back out in the world. And I like that too. I like to feel better after worship. But I don't know that worship is just about us. If it is first and foremost about us, then we've got it all wrong. It is rather about becoming aware of God's holiness, about realigning our lives with the will of God. That is what the Sabbath is about. It is about resting from everything else, taking away all the distractions, and simply worshiping God, saying, God, you above all are worthy of glory, and then following God each day. When we go through difficult days, desert times, it's so easy to lose God because we get anxious and we try to do this and we try to do that. But God, when he gives these rules for living, says the very first thing you have to do is you've got to put me first or this isn't going to work. And then once we have a relationship with God right, then we turn to one another and we say, how can we live in community? And God said there's some boundaries that you need. God says honor your father and mother. Don't commit murder. Don't commit adultery. Don't steal. Don't bear false witness. Don't covet anything about your neighbor. In other words, live respectfully of one another. That concept of that Oregon Trail I've been talking about, they would get together before they had these wagon trains, and they'd literally decide on some rules. They had to agree to these, and they would vote on these rules together, and they came up with some things like no drinking or cursing, and you attended church on Sundays, and those might have been some good rules. But more importantly, on those wagon trains, they decided how they would treat each other. These aspects of the Ten Commandments that deal with one another, that we won't commit violence against each other, that we will respect marriages, that we won't steal from one another, that we will tell the truth, that we won't covet other things. They were important for that journey through those difficult times. And as we go through difficult days, these are important for us as well. Do we honor one another along the way? God expects us to honor our parents and all those in authority. I honor my parents when I do what they have taught me to do, when I realize that they are seeking my welfare. I obey those boundaries of God when I keep from doing certain things, when I love and respect others and would never kill someone, but also when I know I don't kill other spirits, when I don't cause them harms that nick at them and wound them. I honor Valerie, my wife, when I put her first. And those of you who are married, the Lord says to honor this relationship and to keep it first and foremost in your life. When we look at the world and we think about stealing or bearing false witness or coveting other things, which is where these sins arise from, there's an antidote to all of that. That antidote is gratitude. When you look at what you have and you look at the blessings of God and you rejoice in what God has given you, then you have a different view of life. Honesty is always the best policy. When you don't lie, you don't have to remember the lies. It's easy to remember reality, but honesty isn't just about telling fibs. It's about living together truthfully, being in community with one another. Why does God give these boundaries? Because God is trying to create a people that will testify to God's goodness and God's grace. We are always coming back together to reestablish this covenant with God. God calls Moses aside and says, I have made this covenant with these people, and now I want them to be a witness to the world. And we need to reestablish this covenant. Did you know along the Oregon Trail that there were many folks who came to Christ and were baptized? Do you know why that was? Because almost in every one of those wagon trains, there were missionaries. Missionaries who were going west to spread the gospel, and along the way, they shared that gospel with their fellow travelers. God wants us to be God's people, God's witnesses. Can the world, however, tell the difference? In the 2nd century, Tertullian, who was a bishop in North Africa, said this: "See how they love one another." The church was growing quickly, and it kept coming back again and again to what Tertullian said was the most important, that the people of God loved one another. Here in the 21st century, would they say, "See how they love one another"? Or would they say, "See how they fight and fuss"? We are called together to be God's people of grace. As you continue reading past these 10 commandments, God tells Moses specifically why he is giving these. God says, so these will keep you from sinning. Another way to say that is so that these will keep you on track, keep you moving forward. Now, I've been preaching this morning about the 10 Commandments, and in some ways that's preaching about sin, isn't it? I remember years ago a friend of mine said, "Now, Nelson, when you start preaching, you need to preach against sin." I said, "All right." He said, "Just make sure it's not the sins your people are committing." Everybody wants you to preach against sin, but somebody else's sin. What is sin? Well, sin is doing something wrong, right? Or sin is not doing what we know to do, which is sin as well, a sin of omission. In Scripture, sin has this word that in Greek literally means missing the mark. When an archer shot at a target and they would miss the mark, that is the same word for sin. That there's something we're supposed to be and we miss that. We are not doing all God would have us to do. Maybe you know the name Matthew Emmons. Matthew Emmons is an excellent sharpshooter. In fact, when he was young, he won a 50-meter rifle contest in the Junior World Championships. He could shoot standing up, he can shoot laying down, he could hit any target. In 2004, he was headed for the gold in the Olympics in Athens. All he had to do was hit the target. He had been so accurate throughout that whole time that all he had to do was hit the target anywhere and he had the gold medal. And he hit the target. It just happened to be the wrong target. He hit the target in the lane next to him. He was in lane 2, and for some reason he fired and hit the target in lane 3. He dropped from 1st down to 8th. How much are we like that? We know that God has a way of life for us. We know that God is calling us to be God's people, and yet we get in these stressful times and we get stressed out and we miss it. Thankfully, however, Matthew Emmons had another chance. He came back later to win more gold medals. In fact, he says he was so distressed that night that he went out with some friends, and that night is the night he met his wife. For God is gracious. We often miss the target. And what does God call us to do? Thankfully, God gives us grace and calls us to confess that we are not along the right path, that we are not doing what God would have us to do. And God can bring us back together, set us straight, and move us forward. As we go through desert times, it's important to obey the rules.